Okay, hopefully everybody can see and hear me just fine. We're going to get this thing going. We're excited to this first ever financial education workshop with the Change Life Academy, and we're going to go over a lot of really exciting things today and make sure that it's interactive, ask questions. You know, we can go over this in a lot of detail, and this is going to be something that is going to be very helpful. There's a few topics that we're going to go over today, and we are going to primarily we're going to talk about the three things that everyone needs to know about their money, and that's what we're going to start with today. And those three things are taxes and how that affects their money, impact of losses and how that affects their money, and then the third one would, of course, be fees. And we're not going to go into that in a ton of detail today, and my mentor, Doug Foster, here will be talking about that next week. So we're excited to be looking at that and how some of the fees compare with some of the products that are out there and how to kind of really see everything in a side-by-side comparison and things like that. Learning how to avoid the two biggest mistakes people make with their money and how to avoid them. That's the other thing we're going to talk about today. And then as we go, we are going to also have all these other topics. There are some of the 5 biggest wealth transfers that we're going to be talking about in the weeks to come. And that is the first one, mortgages. We're going to really drill in to mortgages, and we're just going to make sure everyone fully understands mortgages, the fastest way to pay off their house, and whether or not they should pay off their house, and everything else that goes along with mortgages. We're also going to talk about qualified plans. Are they good? You know, how do they work? Do you just need to understand them and understand their place and how they fit into somebody's situation? We'll go into those in a lot of detail. And then, of course, taxes. We are going to talk a little bit about taxes today, but we will even hit that in a little bit more and have a whole segment just on taxes as we go. And then college savings, which of course Doug Foster is our resident expert on college savings. He will show you how just by choosing the right vehicle and the right strategy, you can actually increase your income in retirement by almost $1 million, right? So that is a very powerful, powerful training, and that was one that you are not going to want to miss. And then, of course, making major capital purchases is the smartest way to do that, and not resetting compounding, which actually comes back to one of the 2 biggest mistakes people make with their money. So all of this will tie together, and it will be some very powerful education. So feel free to ask questions. This is going to be a very casual environment, and I want this to be interactive. I want people to fully understand how this works so that you can turn around and explain it to others as well. Those are some of the areas. Now, beyond that, there are several other topics. Doug is also an expert on Social Security. We'll have a Social Security topic, and we will have all of these listed under the events of changelife.me so you can see which topic is coming up, and feel free to invite people to jump on. And if you see, for example, that Social Security is coming up, in the future, make sure you start thinking of who might be in that situation that could benefit from that, and we'll start driving to that. If there's a topic like mortgages coming up in 3 weeks and you see that on the schedule and you know when that's coming, start talking to that and driving people to that. So there's a lot of these different topics. Feel free to invite everyone to jump on and see the benefits of what we're offering with this financial education. Okay, so the first thing that I want to talk about is the taxes, and that's one of the things that was alluded to the other day, and we've talked about this a little bit, but there are, and I want to go in here, and there's an easier way to get to this, but hang on just a quick sec. Okay, here we have the tax history in this lovely country that we live in. How many of you knew that at one point in time people were paying over 90% in taxes, income taxes? Isn't that ridiculous? I mean, that is crazy. And if you look at some of these events, and if we highlight some of these events, there's a couple of them that I think are very powerful. For example, right here in 1941, if you made over $5 million, okay, then you were taxed about 81%. So that was what, the Rockefellers and the Carnegies? Not a lot of people that were maybe in that tax bracket. And so you might think not a big deal, right? No, not very many people affected by, a $5 million threshold there. Well, 1 year later, in 1942, something very interesting happened. Not only did the tax bracket go from 81% to 88%, but they also casted a wider net. And they actually lowered the threshold down to $200,000. Now, $200,000 compared to $5 million, it includes a lot more people, okay? So as we go through this time frame here, and we get over here into the 70s, we are still being taxed at a 70% tax bracket if you're making over $200,000 a year. And so at that point, a lot of the corporations started lobbying with the government, and they said, look, we need something. We need some relief here. We need some help. We've got these pensions. They're covering about 80% of somebody's income in retirement. What if we could come up with a vehicle to maybe supplement somebody's income in retirement, 20% maybe of their retirement income, and what if we could postpone our taxes until later? Now, if we look at this in this time frame here in the 70s, that made a lot of sense because it made sense to kick the can down the road into a lower tax bracket. And if we look over here to where we're at now, in these time frames over here, that is considerably lower from the 70s when we were paying a much higher tax bracket. And so they decided to come out with the 401k and the IRA that allowed us to postpone taxes until later, simply to supplement somebody's retirement. So I would argue a couple of the things that we're going to talk about today, there's a lot of people that don't want the general public to know about some of these things. And I think once you start to see how all this works, we'll start to see who's actually in control of all of this money. And if you look at it, and we use the typical example you've probably heard before, but Emily, I'll pick on you. If I'm going to give you a loan, okay, and I write out a check to give you a loan, you're going to want to know two things about that money or that loan before you deposit it. What are those?
When do you want the money back and how much interest rate you charge?
That's exactly right. So what if I say, Emily, well, I actually am doing pretty well financially right now, and I don't really need a lot of money. So why don't we wait until later when I need money, and then based on how much money I need, I'll determine what interest rate to charge you. Not going to cash that loan?
No.
Okay, so if I polled 100 people and I asked 100 people who would take that loan, most people probably wouldn't take that loan. In fact, a lot of people, their first question might be, is the cash going to clear? Or the check going to clear? But if they take that loan, they're going to probably want to know, I want to know exactly what I'm getting into. Well, what's funny is that all of us, millions of Americans, sign up for this deal every day. They say, okay, yeah, let's say that I would like to, take that loan, and I would like to not know how much I'm going to have to pay in the future. So let's say that I have $100,000 in a 401k. How much of that belongs to me? What does it depend on?
Tax bracket.
Okay, so let's say that I am in a 30% tax bracket, okay? How much of that 401k actually belongs to me?
70.
Okay, so it's very easy to look at your account balance and get really excited about how much money you have in your account, right? But we usually don't process and think about how much of that money actually belongs to me. Now, what do you think the average line is? Or what do you think the average tax bracket has been? You want to take a guess?
35%. The average maximum.
The average is actually pushing 60%. So if the average is 60 and you're currently in a 30% tax bracket, which direction do you think taxes are headed? Okay, now, we obviously can't predict the future, and we don't know that for sure, but is it a possibility? It's a possibility and probably a very likely possibility. In fact, if you look at where we're at now, based on history. Now, I said earlier to Emily, I said, when I need money, okay, I'll determine what interest rate to charge you. Does the country need money right now? No. Okay. If we pull up this lovely debt clock, what does that say to us? Okay, so obviously taking a little while to calculate all this, but we're now over 18 trillion. I believe it was 17 trillion the last time I pulled this up. So it's pretty amazing how fast you can get into $1 trillion of debt, right? So if we are in need of money, is it possible that they'll cast a wider net to try to get a little bit more money? Is that possible? Okay, so now if we look at that and we see what happens is that down the road, and this could be any time during retirement. I don't care if you're 60 years old and just going into retirement, you have 30 years where you could easily you could easily be having an increased, tax in the future, even in retirement, even if you're just now, entering into retirement. So are there still things that you can do? Doug Foster always says that if you're looking at a picture of Mount Everest, what is the goal? If you look at a picture of Mount Everest, what would be the goal that most people think? Get to the top. But what's the real goal? Get back down safely after you get to the top. Okay? So that's why we'll have trainings in the future on Social Security and somebody entering into retirement and how to manage taxes even in the retirement years. So it doesn't even have to be someone who's accumulating money. It could also be someone who's entering to that distribution, stage of life. But let's just say, hypothetically, let's just say that in your time frame of accumulating and retirement, let's just say that taxes went up on you, to 50%. Now all of a sudden that account balance that you're looking at, less and less of that belongs to you, right? Now I want to point out something real quick. When I talk about the three things that we need to know about our money, taxes, the impact of loss, and fees, notice that I didn't mention rate of return, which is the one thing everyone uses to decide how they're going to invest their money. It's rate of return. But rate of return is not as big of an impact as some of these other three, because you could get a great rate of return, but if the majority of it goes to taxes, then your net return isn't as good. So you really have to look at some of these other areas and not just focus on rate of return. Okay? So as you can see, that the more your taxes change, the more the ownership of your account changes. And we don't know whether it will be more, and we don't know whether it will be less, but we need to understand it. Yes, Doug.
Okay. Not only do they know, they being the government, where the money is, but they also know that that there's 10,000 baby boomers becoming of age every day. And they also know that there is a minimum distribution requirement at 70.5 where you are forced to take the money out. And can they move that? Absolutely. Yeah. So who's in control ultimately? The government, unless you do something about it.
That's exactly right. So if you didn't hear that on the webinar, the government is not only controlling the percentage that they own, but they're controlling the timing of when they get that with the 70.5 rule. So Emily earlier said, I want to know two things about that loan. Number one, when am I going to have to pay that money back? And people might be in a situation with a residual income that they don't need that money, but they are still going to be required to give, their percentage, to the government, right? So that is definitely a very big, impact. Now we will go into, yes.
One of the biggest things that Robert Kiyosaki is always harping on is who's in control of your money. And the thing that's just been brought up with the 401k, the government is in control of your retirement through those taxes. And so you violated one of the biggest rules in wealth creation.
That's correct. And that's definitely one of the things that we focus on so much in this education is being in control of our money, right? And so, yes, that is correct. The more control we have on our money, the better off we're going to be. Now, I want to look at one other area. Now, this we will take an entire training and go over this in one of our future trainings. We're going to go over these taxes in a lot more detail. But I want to where is my? I went right past it here. I also want to talk about another scenario here where let's say that we have $100,000 and let's say we're getting a 5% rate of return. And let's say we're in a 30% tax bracket, and when we retire, we are also in a 30% tax bracket. Well, one of the things that we need to focus on is that not only does our money compound, and we've all heard the power of compound interest. In our industry, people love to talk about the rule of 72 and how often it takes, or how long it takes for your money to double. Well, there are so many other variables involved with having that money double. And that's why we're talking about that today with these three things. But as you can see, compound interest is a very simple idea. Your money grows, period, right? Okay. One of the things, however, that I want to point out is how the taxes affect the growth of that money. So we've talked about a qualified plan and kicking the can down the road to paying taxes later. But what about paying taxes now? What about paying taxes every year? So let's say that somebody has money. I asked a guy once, he sold some real estate and he had $2 million and wanted to know what to do with it. And I said, what's the best case scenario in your mind? He's like, well, if the banks would start paying me 8% again, that would be best case scenario. Well, best case scenario of 8% in a bank sounds good because it's safe and you're getting an 8% return. But what we don't understand a lot of times is that as our money grows at either a 5% or 8%, if we actually are paying the taxes on that money, it's like having our legs being cut off, every single year and not being able to grow as fast as we need to because we're paying taxes on a yearly basis. So if we run this down, 30 years, that $100,000 could grow to $432,000, but along that time frame, we paid out of our pocket almost $100,000 in taxes. Now, there's obviously one thing that we haven't mentioned yet, and that is this thing called opportunity cost, which you'll hear us talk about all the time. But just to recap, if I spend $1 that I don't have to spend, I didn't just lose that dollar, but I lost what that dollar could earn, right? So if we look at the opportunity cost that we're losing, all of that money that we're paying in taxes every year, if that could have stayed invested, and that, of course, is the power of our compounding growth with tax-deferred growth. So we don't actually have to pay the taxes every year on the money that we're earning in that account. So as we can see on the right there, we have lost opportunity costs that we could have earned on that money. And what's interesting is if you look at the very bottom, if you can see that our net return, our net account balance is not $432,000, but our net return on that $100,000 growing at 5% for 30 years is actually $246,000, pushing $247,000. So basically, it's not just the money growing.
Can they actually see the screen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I'm a little less
Yeah. So you're actually looking at, if you're looking at that, somebody says, okay, a 5% return in the bank that's safe looks really good. But how are we taxed on money in the bank? Ordinary income. Okay, so if we are in a 30% tax bracket, and I can change this to, of course, whatever tax bracket you're in. A lot of people, it's funny, most people that have a lot of money in the bank are probably in a little higher tax bracket because, generally speaking, they've maxed out their 401ks or their qualified plans, and so then they start to resort to other areas to put their money. The average person gets all their money in their qualified plan of work and then some equity in their house. That's a very typical, scenario. So as we,
Well, some people think, well, I'm not paying 40%. Well, that's the effect. That's the marginal tax rate. Your last dollar is taxed at that rate. Your effective or actual tax rate is usually much less. But
Sure.
Still, those dollars are your last dollars are taxed at that marginal tax rate, and a lot of people miss that.
That's exactly right. That's a very good point. Very good point. So, any questions so far on taxes? You see the power, or the impact, I should say, of taxes, which speaks to the power of tax-deferred growth. It also speaks to the power of maybe paying your taxes now. If you think you're going to be in a higher tax bracket later, it speaks to being able to, pay your taxes now. Now, if you don't plan on being in a higher tax bracket later, then that means you plan on being broke. And if you're on this webinar, if you're listening to this, training, hopefully you're not planning on being broke. Hopefully you're planning on fixing that. So the goal, of course, is to be in a better situation later, right?
So I want to understand, maybe I missed something, but So you're showing taxes being paid later
Mm-hmm.
with the two red triangles on the right. But we're preaching paying the tax on the seed today,
Mm-hmm.
not on the harvest later.
Mm-hmm.
So
what
I
this,
guess I'm trying to understand where that factors in.
well, okay, so this is not paying your taxes now. This is saying that we get our money, we put it in the bank, it grows at 5%, and we have to pay our taxes on the growth of that money. So instead of paying our taxes later, or instead of paying our taxes up front, this is actually paying your taxes every year. And so so like a qualified plan at work, you get a tax deduction, it sounds like, right? Which is really a tax postponement.
Correct.
Until later.
You're kicking the can down
Exactly,
the
you're
road.
kicking the can down the road. In a taxed now scenario, you're actually paying income tax now, and then you don't have to pay taxes down the road depending on the vehicle. This scenario is saying, I'm paying my taxes now, then I'm putting my money in a bank or somewhere like that, in a CD or money market, or even in the market.
That's going to tax me.
That's going to tax me
Okay.
on an annual basis every single year. So I'm not getting the tax deferred growth on my money.
Gotcha. Okay.
So yeah, so this speaks to the power of, needing to have, your taxes. Now, if you believe that we're going to be in a lower tax bracket now, then you can, wait until, or if you believe we're going to be in a lower tax bracket later, then you can wait until later. But you just need to understand. You need to say, okay, and maybe you need a balance. Maybe you need some buckets. And maybe in some of your buckets you need some money that might be taxed later, and maybe in some of your buckets you need some money that's going to be taxed now. But in either scenario, there's not a lot of benefit in having your money taxed every year without the tax-deferred growth. So tax-deferred growth is very powerful. So yeah, good question. I'm glad you brought that up. So there are a couple of different topics when you're talking about taxes and how your money is taxed. Taxed now, taxed later, tax-deferred growth, all of which greatly impact your bottom line.
I'll go a little deeper into this marginal tax rate, just for clarification and understanding what Doug was talking about. You may be in a 30% tax bracket, but the marginal tax rate might push you up higher.
Go ahead.
What factors that?
Well, whether you make X amount or 10X amount of money, everybody is taxed, on 10%. And then everybody that makes more money is taxed at the next rate. And then at a certain income level, you're taxed at the next rate. And those that don't make any more money than that, that's their final marginal tax bracket, is the highest ones. Highest one. Those that continue making more money, I think now it's gone back to where Clinton was, about 39.6, close to 40. But when you add in all the brackets on somebody maybe making 100,000, you're in a higher bracket, but you're average because you pay taxes at the lower amounts. Okay, means your actual return will not be the 40% or the 30 or whatever. It might only be 20%. When you figure out what did you make, take what you actually paid in taxes, divide that, you'll come up with your actual effective tax rate. But your last dollars were at that higher rate. Does that help?
So and obviously we can help we can help people work with a CPA and figure out what that is for them, and we can plug their numbers, in, and help them to see how their own investments are being.
And one more thing, for people say making around 100,000, those other brackets ratcheting up there have a much bigger impact than somebody who's making millions, where that's just a dribble that we're in those buckets. But once you get to this high level, and everything you make over that is going to be all taxed at that highest rate, and so it's very disproportionate.
Yeah.
So for lower income people, your actual is going to be probably considerably less than your marginal, but for the very high income earner, they're going to be close.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, what's $15,000 on somebody making $5 million a year?
That's exactly right.
10% on 15,000 is relatively peanuts.
That's right. Okay, so to recap, who doesn't want you to know about taxes? Okay, the government, the government, banks, Wall Street that's collecting a lot of this money. I mean, there's a lot of people that don't want you to fully understand how this works, because they will sell an investment based on a certain rate of return and not tell you that that's just a gross return. If you factor in the actual taxes, it's really going to be a lot less. Nobody ever really speaks to that. People just speak to, they kind of, they make everything sound good, right? So it's just important. This is part of the power of being financially educated and understanding how this works. Now, the next thing I want to talk about, which is one of my favorite topics that I think is the biggest impact on somebody's money, and that is the impact of loss. So there are three things we've talked about so far, and that is taxes, and now the impact of loss. And then, like I said, we'll drill into fees in a detailed training later, but a lot of that depends on different products and different vehicles, because everything has different fees. But that's obviously something to consider when you're looking at an investment. But what I want to look at is there are a lot of things that happened back in the day, and if you look at history, if we look at the 80s and the 90s,
We could go from 76,
mm-hmm.
74 when they passed ERISA,
Mm-hmm.
to 99, you see the biggest whole run ever.
Let's go. I can go back. 76.
74, I think, was when it passed. There were some weeks.
Well, let's get rid of 74. Well, we got the 11. Let's just do. I'll just do 79 just to show you the biggest. These are all positive except for 2. Okay, so what happened? The reason why I bring these up is because if we look at that history I was talking about earlier, we saw a teeter-totter effect happening with money going out of pensions and into the market. And so we had this flood of money leaving and going into the market. And so the baby boomers, this was actually driven more by demographics than anything else. This wasn't because somebody was in, because there was the right president in office. This had nothing to do with politics. This simply had to do with demographics. We had the baby boomer generation that was at their peak earning potential and therefore their peak savings potential. And all of the money was leaving, the pensions and going into the market. And we had an extremely powerful run, in the market. And what this did is it psychologically programmed us to think that money in the market would always go up. Now, prior to the 80s, only the wealthy people invested in the market because you had to buy individual stocks. They didn't have mutual funds. Those came out about the same time as 401ks. And so the average person had to buy one share of GM stock to be able to play in the market. And so that just wasn't, easy for the average person to do. Well, then they came out with mutual funds, and of course Wall Street spent an untold millions of dollars marketing the 401k because that was a great vehicle to promote the mutual funds. And so a lot of stars were aligning just right to get a lot of money to come into the market during these 80s and 90s. Now, I would actually argue that the 90s probably should have never even happened because of the dot-com bubble, which actually burst, which means that a lot of the 90s were an actual bubble, right? They were inflated returns based on the dot-com companies coming into the market. And so if we look at the 80s and the 90s, it's really kind of a freak of nature. It's kind of an anomaly. All the stars aligned just right to have everything happen. But what's important to me in my working with clients is that the psychology behind this. It programmed a lot of people to hang on to these years and to remember these good years and to think that this is where they need to be because they want to remember what it was like to make some of these returns. And as you can see, $1, okay, in this 22-year period of time, $1 would have turned into $13. That is a phenomenal, return on your investment. In fact, the average return was 13.4 and the real return was 12.6. Phenomenal. Everything was great, okay? And then something happened. And of course, I alluded to it with the dot-com, bubble burst, and we had 9/11. And from 2000 to 2002, top to bottom, we had a 46% drop in the market, okay? And as we can see, our dollar, and I actually want to turn this on to, let's see here. I want to turn it on to the actual total return. Okay, now our dollar went all the way down to about 62 cents. Okay, that is extremely significant because I will talk a little bit more about this impact of loss, but I want to look at the reality of where we are at today. I don't think it's even fair to look at a return on an investment over the last 30 years because that includes some of those 80s and 90s. I think that if we look at just these last 14 years, we might have a better understanding of what we're experiencing with a lot of this volatility. You can turn on any news channel or any Bloomberg or any kind of radio, talk show, and the topic of volatility will always come up. You will hear that word volatility all the time. And this volatility is this up and down in the market. Which, if we look at this, our dollar from 2000 to 2002 went down to 62 cents. Okay. Now, we can look at the 28% returns and the 15% returns and the 10. We can get really excited about those returns coming out of 2000 to 2002 there. But what were we trying to do with all those good returns? Catch up, get out of the hole, get our dollar back. Okay. We finally got that dollar back. Okay. In 2005, we had a great little return in 2006. Well, things were looking better, and then what happened? 2008. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to watched half of their retirement disappear in 2008. We have one in the room. It hurts, right? Now, people didn't really react after 2000 to 2002. They were still in this coma from the 80s and 90s, right? I mean, they were still hanging on to those good old days. And they thought that 2000 to 2002 was an anomaly. They didn't think that would ever happen again. And then, of course, it did. It happened again in 2008. And they lost that dollar again, okay? So it took all of these years just to get that dollar back. And then we lost it, and then it took all these years to get it back again.
One of the misconceptions people have is that, but the market is going to come back. My portfolio is going to come back. Think of it as the difference between ranching and dairy farming. What happens in ranching? How many times do you make money on a cow? Once.
When you kill it.
Once when you kill it. Okay? When you're coming into these markets and you're putting money into the market, you're lining up 100 cows, and in 2000, you shot 10 of them. Mm-hmm. And you lined up 100 more in 2001, you shot 13 of the ones that you already had, that you're just bringing into the market, and you shot 13 more of the ones that you put in the year before. They're dead. Those dollars are gone. Mm-hmm. It's not going to come back. You got to rebuild the herd. You've got to get productivity out of the herd that is left. Whereas on dairy farming, and I tell you, that's something you don't ever want to do. Those milkers go down. It's horrible. But with dairy farming, you're not losing your herd. You get to milk them every single day. They produce every single day. And that is a very important piece of the puzzle, where you're putting your money. Are you putting your cattle out to a bunch of wolves where you could lose 30% of them, or do you have them safe in a corral where you get to continually milk them uninterrupted?
That's a very good analogy. And let's actually speak to that with this actual return versus average return. This is the other problem that you'll have when somebody is selling an investment. Because if I could sell everyone in this room and everyone watching and listening to this webinar a 25% average return, that would sound really good, wouldn't it? Okay? I would have people lining up at our door for a 25% average return. So I'm going to give you that 25% average return. In fact, if you give me $100,000, the first year, I'm going to lose 50% of your money. Now, I know you're a little upset, and I know you are down to $50,000 now, but never fear, because in year 2, I'm going to get you 100% return. That sounds good, right? In fact, I actually saw a money manager's prospectus because he was bragging about an 85% return that year. But in 1 month, he had lost 48% in 1 month. It was a very aggressive, very volatile up and down. This is my point. 100% return is 100% return on how much money? $50,000. So as you can see at the bottom of your screen there's your 25% average return. I successfully gave you the 25% return I promised. Now here's what's even crazier. I can legally print that. I can legally print that in my prospectus, and I can advertise that investment as an average return of 25%. And I was accurate and truthful, and I delivered what I said I was going to deliver. But
There's a big misconception out there.
big misconception. This right here is probably the biggest, and I'm going to go back to that screen we were looking at a minute ago to kind of apply this. But this is the hypothetical scenario of what we just saw a minute ago. These are more easy numbers. Now let me give you another scenario. Let's say, and of course as you can see you have a 0% return or gain on your money. Now let's go back and say that I lost 50 and then I gained 50. So let's say that you call me up and you say, hey, you know, I know there's been a lot of volatility. How's my money been doing? And I say, well, you know, Emily, it's been averaging about a 0% return. Now you gave me $100,000. I just told you it's averaged a 0% return. How much do you think you still have?
Yeah, but that's the thing.
You think you have the same. You start, yeah, sounds good. You started with the 100,000. Hey, don't worry about all this volatility. Don't worry about all this up and down, right? Because you've averaged a 0% return. But down 50, up 50, that's an average of 0. Do the math. Down 50, up 50 is an average of 0. And yet you are down 25% on your money. Yes.
And if you think it's a killer accumulating and going up the mountain, wait till you're distributing going down the mountain.
Yes.
It's a double, triple whammy.
And we are going to actually have an entire training just on distribution.
And you will not hear that out there. Almost nobody talks about it.
No one will talk about that, but Doug will train on the sequence of returns in retirement, and he will show the sequence of returns with a negative and a positive and a negative or whatever, and then he will flip it upside down, and if those same returns happened in a different order, it's amazing what it does to your money. It's like devastating. And so the amount of losses that you have on your money in distribution is even that much worse because you're trying to pull money out and you're trying to live on it. And that is just, that's painful.
And Wall Street and their 401k still get their fees.
That's exactly right. They'll get their fees no matter what. Now, who does not want you to know about the impact of losses? Who wants to keep the money in the market? The brokerage firms, Wall Street, everybody, that supports money in the market. Yeah. Now, can you have money in the market as a way of diversification? Absolutely. But do you need to go in eyes wide open and fully understand how this works and do everything you can to help minimize losses? That's the power of this information. We're not saying that there's not a need or a fit or that doesn't apply somewhere. This is just education. People just purely need to understand how this works. Now, if I offered you a 2.5% return versus a 5% return, which one sounds better? 5 always sounds better, right? But if I took the time to plug all these different numbers in, I could show you that a 2.5% that didn't lose as much could actually give you more money at the end of the day than a 5%. Because if you lose more than half as much in one scenario than the other scenario, you have to get out of that hole. So the average return and the actual return are completely different. So in other words, math versus money. Okay? If we brought a math professor in here and gave him 5 problems on the board, and had an average return under each one of the 5 problems, one would think that the highest average return would give you the most money. But in reality, there's so much more involved to actually determine who has the most money at the end of the day. And we'll do that example one day. I've got my wife's grandpa's a math professor, and we'll illustrate this a little bit more. But it's powerful. Average return means absolutely nothing. What you need to find out is if I had X amount then, how much would I have now? Okay? Rate of return is not the most important thing when looking at an investment. That's what I'm trying to get at. Yeah, actual return is what matters. And so if we go back one more time to this market history, we just looked at some hypothetical scenarios there. And if we factor in some of the fees and some of the hidden fees. There's a lot that we're not even showing, but we are literally just showing the impact of losses here. And in this time frame, this 14-year window, $1 turned into $1.40. Okay? That's all that matters at the end of the day. Now, if people are putting more money into an account every month, like a qualified plan at work, they don't see this, right? They just see their money growing because they're feeding it, right? So, of course, it's growing because they're feeding it. But if you actually look at what it would have been, and what it is today without any new money going into it, $1 would have turned into $1.40, period.
So they're also being sold on the match that their employers give them.
Correct.
Which is making it look like it's growing even more.
Correct. Yep.
And they're also being sold on the fact that they think they've gotten back to zero, not taking into consideration all of their contributions from the last 5 years to get back to zero.
Exactly.
Correct.
So the comment, if you didn't hear, was that, a contribution and a match does play a part. And we will drill into that in a lot of detail coming up on the qualified plan training. And we will show you how that works. But let's just double it. Let's say you got a dollar for dollar match. Now your dollar, turned into, instead of $1.40, now you're $2.80. Okay? But how does that compare to other options out there? If you could cut out all the losses, how does that compare? In fact, what if I just cut out all the losses and put a cap on there of 15% and put a floor in there of 0? Now all of a sudden I'm at 286 instead of 240. That's right. So just by cutting out the losses, I'm doubling my money. Now we'll get into that in a little bit more detail later, but I want to emphasize one other thing really quick, is that before we get into fees, and we'll have a whole training just on fees, but before I get into that, if we have $1.40, that means in 14 years my money grew at about 2.27% actual return. Now, for years and years and years, the wisdom has been when you go to retire, you need to retire and live on the what? The interest. You need to live on the interest. So if you have $1 million, you need to live on the interest. Now remember, everyone is still thinking 80s and 90s. Average returns of 10%. Okay? So if you have $1 million, you should easily be able to live on $100,000 a year. Makes sense, right? But that's if you're getting a 10% actual return. What is the actual return in the last 14 years? Okay, 2.25. 2.275, which means that if you want to retire on the interest, if you had $1 million, you'd be able to pull out a little more than $20,000. And how much of that is taxable if it's in a qualified plan? All of it.
That affects Social Security.
And that affects Social Security because that $20,000 counts as income, which subtracts from your Social Security benefits.
And $1 million sounds good.
And $1 million sounds really good. $1 million sounds really good. And $1 million is not easy to get to. In fact, $1 million is really hard to get to when you have the impact of losses. Because every time you get close, they yank it away from you, right? And so as you can see in the last 14 years, we got really close. We got some traction. We went from $1 down to 60 cents in 2002, and then we built all the way up to that $1 in 2007, and then they pulled the rug out from underneath us again, and we fell on our face down to 60 cents again, and then we got all the way up to that point again, and well, we haven't gotten there yet. But let's talk in a couple years and see if it happens again. Is it possible?
I read this morning that came up on this budget proposal. He wants to tax retirement accounts.
Well, they're definitely taxing them.
Well, in
At a higher level.
Oh, at a higher level. Oh, yeah, at a higher level.
And
Can they change that?
Absolutely.
Are they in control? They're in control.
They did under Clinton. A lot of people don't know about it. $750,000, which was indexed. There was a 15% excise tax on top of the tax. Can they do that again? You bet they can.
529 plans, they're planning on starting to tax those.
Yes.
And on a Roth IRA. Is a Roth IRA tax-free guaranteed? There's little fine print in there that says the government has the right to change their mind upon what their needs are.
Okay.
Where do I sign up?
Okay, so to wrap this up, what I need to emphasize is who is in control, all right? Now, who is in control of their own education?
We are.
We are. Everyone is in control of their own education. Are we getting this education in school?
No.
Can you get a finance degree and not learn this? Yes. Okay. Yes. Yes. So yes, we are not learning about this in school. Everyone does need to learn this. It speaks to the value of what we're trying to do with this Change Life Academy and this education, and really giving the average person access to the wealthiest, mentors out there to help them understand how this works. This is something that we're not going to hear because people are out there selling golf clubs, and we'll use that analogy several times, but nobody is actually teaching golf swing or technique. They're simply selling golf clubs. And honestly, they don't care to explain the impact of losses, the taxes, or the fees. Some of them they have to get a signature and to get the product sold. But at the end of the day, they're selling golf clubs. They're not teaching education. Our goal with what we're trying to accomplish here is to teach education, teach principles. Nothing that we went over today was rocket science. It's simple math. It's simple history with taxes. It's simple numbers. If you want to watch it over and over to have it sink in, that's fine. But part of this membership and part of this ongoing education is that you don't have to just hear this once. This is something that we will be learning on, and we'll be having weekly trainings. We'll be having a lot of this, and we'll be picking different topics. Due to time, we are out of time, and so we will pick up some of these other topics as we move forward. But just to lead in to the next topic, in fact, the next topic that we'll talk about will be the 2 biggest mistakes people make with their money, and then we'll get into fees after that. But one of the 2 biggest mistakes that people make with their money is, number 1, they don't have access to their money when they need it. A lot of foreclosures would be avoided if they just had access to some of their money. A lot of fees and losses would be prevented when somebody cashes out their 401k if they just had access to a little money. A lot of Americans are cashing out 401ks in between jobs because they don't have access to money. We would not be paying 18% on credit cards if we had access to money when we needed it in an emergency. The second biggest mistake we make, and all of that trumps rate of return. All of that is far more important than rate of return. The second biggest mistake people make with their money is they keep resetting compounding. Compound interest works best over what? Time. But everybody tends to build up a little money and then spend it. Build up a little money and then spend it. We will teach you the strategy using the golf swing technique. We will teach you the strategy of how to let your money grow uninterrupted and use the concept of leveraging other people's money, which of course is what the wealthy have always done. And that's what we'll talk about moving forward. So with that being said, we will wrap up today's webinar, and I am just going to check real quick to see if we have any questions before we wrap things up here. It doesn't. Okay, awesome. Can you repeat the questions you last? Okay. Hopefully we repeated some of those questions. Hopefully you heard some of those. It looks like we don't have any questions. So with that being said, thanks to everyone for getting on, and we will see you next week.